Our next speaker is Courtney Spikes. And Courtney Spikes, similar to my relationship with Ron Gibbs, is another best friend I have, whom I've never met in person. We met online when I helped her with her presentation on Haussmann in Paris, and we've collaborated on a number of other presentations since then, including a project we're in the middle of right now, helping the San Francisco Giants develop a historical presentation to go with their boat tour of San Francisco Bay. She is a historical consultant, has been a lecturer at Loyola Marymount University and a faculty member at Mount St. Mary's in UCLA, where she developed an innovative curricula in French history. She has a BA from UPenn and a PhD from UCLA. She is a vice president of the California Map Society, and most importantly, married to Craig Perry and mother of her son, Connor. And with that, I give you Courtney Spikes.
Oh, thanks, everybody. So excited to be here. What an amazing presentation from Tom and Jim. I really enjoyed it. And I just wanted to give a little of my time to LaDonna Niggy, who had a question about the sunken ships. So the sunken ships remained sunk. They actually were converted into hotels, shops, storage, and then eventually just built over. So it's fascinating history. Just love it. But today I'm here to talk about Napoleon and to look at the historical context and a sort of cultural realm around the Battle of Waterloo. First of all, I'd like to thank the California Map Society so much for inviting me to speak today. Tom Paper for organizing just an amazing conference with diverse and speakers with so many interesting topics. I'm going to show some PowerPoint presentations, and then I'm going to hop on over to the digital gallery and show you some maps and an exhibit that Thomas put together over there. So let me share my screen. And can everybody see that?
Yep.
Yep.
Thank you, Emily. So why is Waterloo such a seminal battle in European history? Why is it so important? And I thought some historical context might help us answer this question, because there's a lot of different interpretations about Napoleon, a lot of fans, a lot of detractors. So I just thought it'd be interesting to see sort of like, what was it like then and what were the perceptions of him at that time? And let me just click there. So just a quick overview for Napoleon. This is a very abbreviated timeline. Napoleon was born in 1769, and this is important because it wasn't until 1768, the year before, that the island of Corsica, on which he was born, he's really an Italian family, had been taken over by France, which made Napoleon technically a French citizen, and it allowed him to qualify to attend French military schools, sometimes on scholarship, and learn a lot of the tactics and studies that he used later to great advantage. He would die at the age of 51, which is like sort of my heart because I'm 51 this year. And it was 200 years ago on May 5th that he passed on the island of St. Helena, his second island of exile. He got a lot done in a short period of time. The French Revolution was 1789 to 1799. And hold on, I gotta use this clicker. And at the age of 23, Napoleon volunteered to be part of the French Revolutionary Wars. He made a name for himself because he went on to become a very successful leader and running the Italian campaigns for them. And he was actually in Egypt being defeated by the English, ironically enough, in 1799 when he escaped, came up to Paris and actually staged a coup d'etat in November of 1799, declaring himself and two others the leaders of the First French Republic. About a month later, he got rid of his two friends and he became the sole consul of the French Republic until the age of 34. He then decided, oh, there's beautiful images of him. And these are all paintings that are like 6, 7, 8 feet tall and 4 and 5 feet wide. They're massive, showing him hard at work as the first consul, giving you some work on the Napoleonic Code and other things he's doing. But then he decided he'd rather establish an imperial power, become a monarchy in a sense, have a hereditary line. And in 1804, crowned himself Emperor of France for the First Empire of France at just the age of 35. And here he is by the beautiful painting by Ingres and all of his regalia. And later on, Jacques-Louis David would paint him about 1812 in this work where it shows him hard at work for you. In the corner, you can see, sorry, I'm just trying to move these images. the clock, it's about 4:15 in the morning. And we know it's morning time because if you look down at the candles behind his elbow, the candles are down to the nubs. And you can see his papers that he's working on. Over here to the right is the Code Napoleon. His sword is off. He's just doing the progress, the purpose of leading his people and running the country. And he was doing all this between the ages of 35 and 45. Of course, he would be defeated, have his first exile to Elba, less than a year later, come back, emperor again. It's called Les 100 Jours in France because he was the leader again for 100 days. Of course, that would be ended at the Battle of Waterloo on June 18th, 1815, ultimately exiled much farther away to the island of St. Helena, controlled by the British, and then he would die in 1821. And here you can see in 1810, he divorced his first wife, Josephine, who's probably his most famous wife, married the daughter of another imperial ruler, Francis II of Austria. This is Marie Louise and their son, the King of Rome, ostensibly Napoleon II, but he would never take the throne. His first island of exile was Elba. And as you can see here, it's just off the coast of Italy. And that bigger island to the left is Corsica. That's where Napoleon was born. And so he's exiled to this tiny little island in between, which made it easy for him to come back. He came back for the 100 Jours. This is one of these depictions of him arriving in France and the armies and troops rallying behind him. Of course, he's defeated at Waterloo. And then they decide to send him much farther away, all the way down here off the coast of Africa to the island of St. Helena. There was no way he was going to come back. And this is a great map of St. Helena. What's interesting about this island is that at sea level, it's actually sunny and quite lovely. But Longbourn, where he was housed, Longbourn, where his house is actually up a higher elevation. So there was a lot of mist, a lot of rain. It was very mildewy and moldy. It wasn't a nice place to live. So Napoleon, at the height of his power in 1812, controlled almost all of Europe. It was either under his control or affiliated with him, or the leadership had been defeated in battle. And at 1812, height of his power. And you can see here, the pink line around it shows all of the territory that was technically under his control. And, you know, Napoleon had written the Napoleonic Code, which was a codification of all laws, and modernized the French law system. He restored connection to the Catholic Church that had been broken with the French Revolution. He instituted and implemented the metric system that every country but America uses today. He created a central bank and by all accounts had the greatest army in the world and was the most feared general. And in terms of this fear, I thought it'd be interesting to look at some of the popular culture around it. You know, Britain, which hadn't been invaded by Napoleon, had a lot of cultural production around this fear of Napoleon coming. And there's a lot of songs written. And John Bull here on the left is representing the sturdy English, and the little bony, skinny, short guy is Napoleon. And Bonaparte was nicknamed Bony, Little Bony, Bonaparte Bony. And this actually would be translated later into the Bony Man or the Boogeyman. And so some of the songs about him were fear that he was going to invade. When, oh, when does this little Bony come? Perhaps he'll come in August. Perhaps he'll stay at home. But it is, oh, in my heart, how I'll hide should he come. Another one, Little Bony, Cock a Horse. Oh dear, little Boney's coming over with legions of troops to land them at Dover. But our brave volunteers, they'll soon do him over and blow him quite over to France. And there's a lot of political caricatures and cartoons, you know, representing Britannia being afraid of Napoleon coming across the channel with his troops from France and somehow invading and enslaving the population. Of course, this wasn't limited to just adults. In popular culture, in everyday life, parents and school teachers were trying to frighten their children as well, striking terror to the hearts. You know, they have these images of Napoleon sharpening his knife and fork, about to cut down the children and eat them for dinner. Parents might say, oh, if you don't do your chores, Boney's going to come get you. Or schools, there's lots of stories about kids being in school and being terrified that Boney was going to come attack them and take them away. And in fact, one recollection of one girl is, the earliest idea I've had of Napoleon was that he was a huge ogre or a giant with a large flaming red eye in the middle of his forehead and long teeth protruding from his mouth, and which he would devour naughty little girls, especially those that did not know their lessons. And in fact, a lot of the caricatures of Napoleon show him being the child of the devil, suckling at the teat of Satan. So this is a lot of the cultural production around Napoleon, and how people thought of him and what he represented in his control of Europe and his feared army. And in political cartoons, I think this one's a really interesting one because by 1805, Napoleon is only 36 years old. He's been emperor for 1 year, but it's already a sort of a fait accompli that he's controlling Europe, and it's sort of an accepted cultural trope, if you say. Here on the left-hand side of this cartoon, you can see Sir William Pitt, who's representing as the Prime Minister of England, and then you have Napoleon as Emperor of France. And in the middle of them, they are carving up what would be a traditional British Christmas pudding, the plum pudding, the steamed fruit cake, and they're cutting it up, and here it's represented as a globe. And Britain, because of its master of the Navy, was in charge of all the oceans, and here Napoleon is just slicing off Europe for himself. And of course, the cartoon's arguing that neither of these men will either be fully sated at any given time. So there were also obviously critics of Napoleon. And here's one talking about the light of the 19th century, referring to the Enlightenment of the 18th century. And here it's saying the art of enlightening men in the manner of tyrants. And what we see here is Napoleon lighting a cannon, and the smoke from wars is blinding his subjects and citizens from seeing their rights as created by the French Revolution. So these rights of man and all these privileges in a book are being hidden by Napoleon's body as he sends everybody off to war. So we have fear and critics and humor along the way. So what happened? Where did it go? How did it all end? Well, two key events. First would be Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812 and his war with the German Confederate States in 1813. And here's a figurative map created by Charles Menard. I gave you an English version, so it'd be easier to read all the terminology. Obviously, it'd be originally done in French. And what Menard was so wonderful at doing is creating these two-dimensional representations of a lot of data. And so the red line that starts on the left of your screen going to the right are Napoleon's troops marching into Russia starting in June of 1812, heading all the way to Moscow to try to defeat Alexander I. The width of the line is representative of the number of troops, as well as the distance they're traveling across. The black line going from Moscow back out are his retreat, and the number of troops obviously diminishing. And the lines going downward like this to the graphic table give you a sense of the date and temperatures of the retreat. Unfortunately for Napoleon, excuse me, winter came extra early that fall and was significantly colder. We're looking at, 30 degrees below freezing in some points here. And you can see quite clearly how much the army of Napoleon was decimated. Part of this was due to the fact that Tsar Alexander knew he could not defeat Napoleon in a head-on battle on the open field. And so what he did instead is he used a scorched earth philosophy, where Napoleon would march in, they would decimate all the food, livestock, and housing to the detriment of all the people living there, but destroyed everything as Napoleon advanced. So there would be no supplies, there would be no food, there would be no shelter. And they would do small sort of guerrilla armed tactics against the army to slowly pick them off. Most famously, Alexander burned down his own capital city of Moscow rather than capitulate. So Napoleon does actually get to Moscow, claim the capital city, but this map here, created in 1813 by Alexander Bulgakov in this beautiful book from that time period, shows all the areas in red in Moscow that were destroyed by fire as a result of them leaving nothing for Napoleon when he arrived. So Napoleon actually never defeated Alexander, and then obviously when he marched out in his retreat, his army was decimated. The next year, so he flees to Paris and tries to pull together his political coalition, so he's not thrown over at that time because he doesn't have his army. But then the sort of German principalities and the Prussians get together, and they start to realize he's weakened, and they plan another attack. Napoleon builds another army and is ultimately defeated in October of 1813 at the Battle of Leipzig. I have a map here that shows how Napoleon was basically surrounded by all of the Allied coalition. Keeping in mind, this is the 6th coalition army of European powers that has attempted to defeat Napoleon during his time in power. So it's taken 6 so far. With the loss of Leipzig, the coalition army marches into Paris. Napoleon is forced to abdicate. He is not allowed to have his son Napoleon II take over. And in fact, they are sent to Austria, and the English, Russia, Prussian, and Austrian coalition take over. And Napoleon, of course, is exiled to Elba. So how does he go from being emperor of all of his raid, to suddenly just being exiled in this amazing political cartoon where it shows his broken sword and he's walking backwards on an ass, heading to Elba, leaving Fontainebleau, the seat of power in France, the fallen hero, to this little island of Elba here, just on the coast of Italy. And there's many, many political cartoons. This is one of them showing little Boney sitting on the island of Elba, thinking about what could have been, crying his eyes out. His sword is in his scabbard because he's not fighting, looking at the continent of Europe, wondering what went wrong. And of course, surrounded by bats because, of course, this image of him being Satan persists. He was sent to Elba with 2 million francs per year as his pension and 500 soldiers to rule over his small island. Not surprisingly, there's a lot of political caricature about the fall of Napoleon. This is a typical trope going up and down the stairs. They use it for drunkenness and for rise and fall of all sorts of social norms, but this one is specific to Napoleon. It was done in German. Here he is as a little boy in Corsica, a revolutionary soldier, a revolutionary, a general, and then he becomes first consul. And at the height of the power, he's emperor of Europe. And then, of course, he falls down. He loses the battle in Spain. He has to retreat from Russia, being pulled in a sled. And then, of course, the Battle of Leipzig is his last defeat from the coalition, and he's sent to his end. What's interesting here is that even in the flames of hell, it says you still have to keep an eye on him because this guy's pretty persistent. And in fact, he was. So in 1814, the monarchies of Europe are restored. Louis XVIII, who is the younger brother of Louis XVI, who was beheaded during the French Revolution. He comes back, takes power as king. King George is still king of Britain. He's the one that we won our Battle of America from. And Prince Frederick William of Prussia, Emperor Francis II of Austria, and that's the father of Marie Louise, who had been married to Napoleon. So Marie Louise and her son Napoleon II are taken back to be under the watchful eye of Francis II, so that they basically can raise Napoleon II so he won't want to be another Napoleon. Ferdinand VII of Spain had been in prison for almost a decade in France after Napoleon had taken over Spain in 1803. He's now restored to power as well. And the last thing these guys want to see is a return of Napoleon to France, which he does. Less than a year from his time of exile in Elba, Napoleon coordinates an escape, lands in the south of France, and marches in 20 short days to the city of Paris, reclaims his title. What I like about this image is that it actually gives you the headlines of Paris in the newspapers as he's making his way closer and closer to Paris. And what's great is, they call him the cannibal, the Corsican ogre, the monster. As he gets closer to Paris, suddenly it's Bonaparte, Napoleon, the emperor. And finally, his imperial and royal majesty have made his entry into the Tuileries amid his faithful subjects. And what's interesting about this story is that when Napoleon arrived, he wasn't 100% sure what was going to happen. And there's very famous stories of him making his way north to Paris. And then troops were sent down to arrest him, to stop him. And Napoleon famously is supposed to have said, the soldiers are pointing their bayonets at him, saying, halt. And he says, stands forward, goes right up to them, puts his chest in their guns and says, are you going to shoot your emperor? And the soldiers go, Vive l'Empereur! And they rally around him. His generals come forward, and he basically gets, 100,000, 200,000 troops to join him and rally back to their emperor. So, of course, the coalition is not going to be happy with this. So the 7th Coalition Army of Europe comes forth to battle Napoleon yet again. So Napoleon has spread out his troops in anticipation of an invasion from the coalition army. He's in the north, of course, with about 125,000 troops. The closest ones to him are Wellington, who's come from England, and Blücher from Prussia. There's some more coming from Prussia. Russia's promised to send some. Austria is sending some, but they're going to be delayed. They're going to get there later in the summer. So Napoleon has sort of two choices here. You can choose a defense and delay tactic, which would maybe let him weaken the armies and hopefully come to an agreement that lets him retain power. But he was a little nervous about having troops back on French soil, foreign troops on French soil again. Or he could choose to have a decisive battle with the troops that were closest to him and perhaps scare off the Russians and Austrians from even coming. And that's what he chooses to do. And what's important about this is that Wellington is near Brussels, and Napoleon doesn't have enough army to defeat Wellington if he combines with the Prussian troops with Blücher who are coming to join him. So his plan is to actually go through the middle and try to pick them off one by one, or to hold them off as they go. And here's a map that gives us a sense of the troop movements from a broader perspective. So Wellington is up here in the northwest. Blücher with the Prussian troops are coming in from the northeast, and Napoleon is coming up from the south. And again, his plan is to take the blue line through, hold off the Prussian troops, and then turn his attention to Wellington. And there are a couple of battles that happen. He actually has a very successful battle at Ligny against the Prussians and defeats them. They're not expecting him, and they do push back, but they don't really go as far east as he predicts. They actually wrap back around, and he has to send about 33,000 troops with General Grouchy up to keep following the Prussians, and ultimately enough will come to Waterloo to support Wellington. So there's Ligny, Quatre Bras against Wellington's forces before they get to the main point of Waterloo. One of the things to keep in mind is that Napoleon completely reorganized the military. And in his reorganization, he made what would we consider probably a more modern set of forces. He established corps that had their own troops, cavalry, and cannon, led by a general. So they were smaller, they were more nimble, they were more mobile. And so it was actually, and gave the generals autonomy. And so they were actually able to move very quickly. Napoleon's successes were really in part dependent upon the fact that they could separate out, instead of being one big army marching and utilizing resources, they could separate out over different roads and take different paths to come together when needed. So it was a much more mobile method of fighting that really made him so successful. Now, of course, Wellington, who's much younger, had studied Napoleon tactics extensively. So he was very, very well prepared. I'm just going to check on the time. Can someone tell me what time it is?
You're at 22 minutes.
Great, thanks, Mike. So I'm going to jump over to the maps in just a second and walk you through some of those details. What I'd love to do is to show you a few more political cartoons of the aftermath of Waterloo. Oh, so there was Ligny, Quatre Bras, Havre, and Waterloo. So after Waterloo, there was a lot of cultural production again, and the French perspective, which I think is very interesting in this beautiful drawing of the last defense of the French troops against the British. The French perspective was very interesting. They sort of said, having conquered and subdued all of Europe, the French lost in less than 8 days all the fruit of 20 years of glory. But it was not by the lack of courage or the lack of ability in ourselves, nor by the courage or ability of our enemies. No, it was by the excessive harshness of climate, which is speaking about the rain that really it created a muddy groundwork, which made it hard for them to move the artillery. But they say, even without our allies, even without our armies, the genius of France was recreated by Napoleon as if by magic, and a new army still made our enemies tremble. But the inconsistency of fortune, the cowardly betrayals of people who went to the other side, and the French, being much inferior in number, succumbed to the iron of our enemies. But it was then that we saw these models of brave, and here they're talking about the Imperial Guard, that never surrendered, who were surrounded on all sides, who uttered these memorable words: the Guard dies, it does not surrender. And here we're talking about the elite French Imperial Guard, which I'll talk more about when we go to the map. Napoleon, of course, is depicted as a deserter. He fled the battle instead of surrendering. We have, French depictions of him as a deserter running off. And then this one, he's saying the sacrifice of Napoleon riding off on his horse. And here's Napoleon saying to Death, who's riding on his behind him, "I sacrifice all this to you," referring to the death of Waterloo. But Death says, "Oh, don't worry, you will soon be there." And this one we have on the left, General Blücher, who, by the way, was 72 years old at the time of this battle, and to the right, Wellington. And here they are skimming off. It's called the Vat, or I like to say the last battle. And Blücher saying, "My dear Wellington, I'm starting to skim. I hope you will help me." And Wellington responds, "My pleasure, Blücher. I'm ready to follow you, but above all, work hard tonight." And here we see Napoleon being mocked by jumping rope, the imperial jump, or the great maker of tricks. Again, Blücher on the left, Wellington on the right. Blücher saying, "My little comrade, do the somersault." Napoleon saying, "Gentlemen, this game displeases me. It is the last trick I will make of you." And Wellington saying, "Sire, you jump for the king now." And just one more of these. The origin of the imperial stifle. Blücher saying, "My dear friend, this man breathes on your side." And Napoleon saying, "Gentlemen, don't choke me, please save my life." And Wellington's like, "No, relax, my friend, this business is done." And here we have celebratory images where the leaders of the European coalition have now placed placed Napoleon in a bottle, much like you would one of those ships. And of course, Louis XVIII is on his knees, thanking them profusely for giving him back his throne. Some other more unflattering depictions of Napoleon would be Little Boney goes to pot here in 1816 after he's exiled to St. Helena. Here he is on a chamber pot labeled the Imperial Throne, sitting on the island of St. Helena with the brimstone next to him. And of course, Death comes up offering him a gun saying, "If you had one spark of courage left, take this." Napoleon responds, "Perhaps I may, but only if you take the flint out first." And here we have some imagery of Waterloo as a tourist pit stop, which it did become. Waterloo became a very profitable and famous stop for sightseeing for many, many years. This image is a little grim because it shows all the graves of the soldiers representing the 50,000 lives that were lost that day. They have their arms sticking out and things like that. People often came to find souvenirs, to find relics, things like this. And we have some of this is the Belle Alliance, one of the areas of the defeat on June 18th, 1815. So let me now stop my share and now reshare to the maps on the digital gallery. We good to go with this?
Yep.
Thank you. So here we have a variety of maps from different countries and with different purposes, right? Every country would map something differently depending on what their agenda was. I'm going to go to one later on to go into detail, but here we have one with the Battle of Waterloo showing a lot of the terrain. This one's a close-up of Belle Alliance. The red represent Wellington, the greenish blue represent the Prussians, and down here to the south is the French troops by Napoleon. And if we go here, you have obviously the British love to celebrate the Battle of Waterloo. And they have these newspapers that would come out with these beautiful detailed maps. What's interesting here is that we're looking south. So we're coming from Wellington's perspective here. So here's the red of Wellington's troops, the yellow of the Prussian troops on the left, and the French troops in light blue at the top of the page. And so we're looking from the ridge of Wellington's standpoint out over the battle. And here we have another great one, again, from Wellington's perspective. This is also a British map showing some of the detail. And this is a panorama of the Battle of Waterloo. So it is a very interesting circular type of map, all these different ways to look at it. Postcards later on with the images, photographs, etc. of the area. This is much later, of course. And then this map, which is the one I actually want to spend a little bit more time on. What's interesting here is that here's the Battle of Waterloo, 18th of June, 1815, and we don't see something here. We don't see the Prussians represented here. The British are just focused on what they did, but of course the Prussians were instrumental to the success of the British because they not only took away about 30,000, 35,000 of Napoleon's troops and kept them busy, but also the Prussians came and offered support at the last stage of the battle. So, great. So a little bit of time to go over. So at the actual Battle of Waterloo, okay, there's like a couple 100,000 troops with the different members of the coalition, but actually at the actual Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon has between 70, 74,000 troops. Wellington has about 68 to 72, and Blucher has 48 to 52. The numbers fluctuate a little bit. And Napoleon actually decided to fight Blucher and the Prussians first because he looked at their lines of communication, and he assumed that because Wellington would be dependent upon getting back to the channel for his line of communication, he would not risk putting his troops over to support the Prussians if Napoleon attacked the Prussians first. So that's why he attacked the Prussians first at Ligny, started to divert them off to the west, although they did come back around. And he was right. And then he was able to attack Wellington quite successfully. And at the beginning of the Battle of Waterloo, we see here Wellington established his line along this upper ridge, which definitely gave him an advantage. Napoleon was coming down at the bottom of the ridge. And Wellington had been able to establish 3 farms, Hougoumont, La Haye-Sainte, and Papelotte. So he was able to put his troops in a barricaded area closer to the French front line with artillery, which gave him a bit of an advantage, even though he had fewer numbers. And Wellington also had a disadvantage because less than half of his troops were actually English. These were a coalition. There was the Dutch and other troops involved there as well. And they were much more inexperienced than the French. So it looked like Napoleon would probably have a good ability to do this. But of course, Wellington had the farms. It rained a lot the night of the 17th. The night before the battle, it rained and it was extremely cold. This did a couple of things. It made it difficult for the soldiers to get warm, get fed, and feel really at their best for the day of battle. It also meant that the area was soaked and the ground was very wet, which made it difficult to move artillery up to get a better position to fire upon your enemy for either side. Napoleon used this strategy quite a bit. And because of that, Napoleon decided to wait. So instead of attacking first thing in the morning, he waited till about 11 o'clock, hoping the land would dry out a bit. And soldiers' depictions and letters they wrote about and memoirs about this talk about the fact that the fields hadn't been sown yet, hadn't been harvested. So there's fields of rye that are actually quite high, making it harder to see troop movements and what's going on. And with the smoke and the battle, this battle is often described as being hard to see what's going on even right in front of you. So that was another factor as well. Napoleon used a tactic that had worked for him well. He first attacked Wellington's right flank over here at the farm of Hougoumont. He sent his troops in to attack Hougoumont, assuming that Wellington would send his reserve troops back here around to support this to protect his right flank. But Wellington had studied Napoleon enough to know that this was a tactic. What Napoleon had hoped to do was weaken the central line so that he could send his troops forward, break up the army, splinter them, and win the battle, which he'd done so many times before. Wellington didn't fall for this, and it was a bloody, bloody day at Hougoumont. Many stories about that. So later on, about 4 o'clock, Napoleon sends in General Ney with the charge, trying to establish the ability to bring up his artillery closer to La Haye-Sainte so he could fire onto the troops of Wellington. He is able to do that, but the attack by General Ney is fought off quite well by the troop setups by Wellington. They had these very strong squares of troops, much like the Roman formation. And so the cavalry would come up and there was nowhere for them to go, and they were just getting decimated. So they retreated. And eventually the Prussians, who were battling him, it's not shown in this map, but the Prussians had come back. Blücher was here in Planchenois, so more troops had to be taken off the central line to defend off the Prussian attack here, and the Prussians were coming up here to support Wellington. So at about 6 o'clock, huge center push, and because Wellington had not given up any of his reserves, he was able to consistently replenish against all the forward push that Napoleon had such success with in previous battles. And at 7 o'clock, after 8 hours of hard fighting, Napoleon called upon his most experienced, battle-hardened soldiers, the elite Imperial Guard. There was about 3,000 of them. They made their formation and they followed pursuit here through this central line that had been attacked by Ney. But Wellington actually had an unexpected and surprising amount of firepower and really surprised the Imperial Guard and was killing more quickly than they had expected. And they actually start to retreat to regroup. They weren't fleeing, but they were just retreating to regroup and get back in formation. But the other French soldiers saw this. And the Imperial Guard is supposed to be the strongest, the fearless, they never give up. And to see them start to retreat in the midst of the chaos of this long and horrible day of battle, the French troops fell apart and started to flee. In fact, some are said to say, "Le garde recule, sauve qui peut." The guard retreats, save yourself. Some would dispute whether or not soldiers said this, but this is what the legend has. Napoleon, in fact, once the Prussians are able to break through the line and the French splinter off, Napoleon barely escapes on horseback, leaving his headquarters and his carriage with a lot of diamonds, jewels to help him pay for things, and many of his accoutrements behind, and barely escapes, flees to Paris in the hope that he can recall the troops that he had kept in France back to him to maybe defend and have a last stand at Paris. The French Imperial Guard, of course, did regroup, did stand their ground, shouting out, "Le garde meurt, il ne se rend pas." The guard dies, it does not surrender, even when offered the chance to surrender by the Prussians, and fought to the death. At 8 p.m., the battle was effectively over. Wellington and Blücher met at La Belle Alliance to acknowledge their win. Wellington decided that the battle should have an Anglo-sounding name and chose the location of his headquarters, which is actually much higher up here in Waterloo, south of Brussels. And so that's what they decided to name the battle. The French lost approximately 25,000 men. 9,000 more were captured by the Allies, and the Allied coalition lost about 23,000. So about 50,000 soldiers died that day in the battle. Let me stop my share. So I'm almost out of time. There's so many stories, little stories about the battle. I know many of you who are military aficionados probably know them better than I do, but I just think what's interesting about this is that you have to understand how ominous Napoleon was, or was believed to be, or perceived to understand why defeating him at the Waterloo was such a significant win for all of Europe. They exiled him once, he came back, and they wanted to finish him off. And this battle wasn't expected to be won. I mean, Wellington really didn't have the advantage. Napoleon's strategy should have worked. But there's a lot of factors in the day that caused his defeat. And in fact, the Allied troops would remain bivouacked, would be stationed in Paris for 3 more years in order to prevent any of this happening again. The Bourbon monarchy was restored until yet another revolution happened in France. And in fact, Napoleon's nephew would rise to power in the later half of the century to become Napoleon III. I'm going to stop there, open it up to questions. I think there's some in the chat.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Courtney. That was terrific.
Okay. Oh, what might have Waterloo done differently? If I would argue that if Napoleon hadn't waited the day of the 17th and had gone on to continue to attack Wellington after the Quatre Bras success on the 16th, he probably could have defeated Wellington because they wouldn't have had enough time to really get his central line established. So I think that's one thing he could have done. Let's see, are there any other questions? That was the only one in the chat.
Courtney, Ron, just a follow-up. So was Napoleon really overconfident from his recent victories?
I would say overconfident would not be a word I would use Napoleon for this battle. I think he was pretty nervous. I think he knew his strategy. I think he understood his battle plans that had worked in the past. They just didn't play out. And to be honest, if he'd been able to get back those 33,000 troops that he had sent off with General Grouchy to attack the Prussians, he actually might have had enough manpower to break the front line of Wellington before the Prussians arrived. But, these are all what ifs.
But loved your animated presentation, the illustrations, the cartoons. It just brought it to life. Congratulations.
Oh, I'm so glad. Thank you.
Spectacular.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree, Courtney. That was amazing. Just love the visuals.
Right. It's such a rich history, and there's so many wonderful images out there. And I just think it helps us get in the mindset of understanding what Napoleon meant in Europe and why. Yeah. I mean, we can't even really comprehend it today, sort of.
It feels a little bit like a horror movie that, they thought they'd killed him and then he rises up out of the coffin and comes back. If he had won, do you think it's a fait accompli that he would have been defeated shortly thereafter by another, the 8th coalition?
That's a good question. I think that's a very good question. I think that Napoleon was mistaken. I think the Russians and the Austrians would have continued to fight on, and they would have gone to Paris because they had that taste of first victory after the Battle of Leipzig. And they knew that they could get all the way to Paris. They knew his troops were diminished. And any new troops he was able to conscript would be inexperienced at that point. So if he had won Waterloo and had come back, I think the Russians and the Austrians would have come. And remember, Austria held his wife and his son. So there was a bit of bargaining going on there too, I'm sure.
Weren't his troops decimated from the Russian campaign? How did he bring back enough troops to even fight the coalition?
He had a year. He had a year before he was exiled. So he came back beginning of 1813 to Paris and, rallied the existing troops, brought together his remaining generals and officers, and then they did a conscription force again. And some of the retirees came out as well. It's interesting when Napoleon first marched through Europe, his claim was, I'm bringing the revolution and the ideals of the revolution to these people that are, oppressed by monarchies, right? That was the original intent of taking over Europe. But of course, when his own imperial ambitions came to light in 1804, the gig was up, right? Everybody knew what was really going on. And there were many battles that I didn't talk about in that time period, but Napoleon's tactics and speed, again, the modernization of that army into these corps that were basically independent mobile units with generals that had been trained by him and he trusted, the speed at which they could attack, the speed at which they could get across to a battle and surprise the enemy, huge impact on modern warfare.
Courtney, thank you so much. This was just terrific.
My pleasure.